Hello brothers and sisters, and welcome back to an all-new Sermons in the Park. As always, I am your Reverend Jamie McCaskill. I want to thank you for joining me here again on this Sunday. It's always great to be here. I know yesterday we all celebrated, well I should say, we all mourned the Remembrance Day of September 11th attack that was committed over 20 years ago. It's just crazy to think of. I remember the day that happened. I woke up, my brother told me, I was actually getting ready for a new job, and my brother told me that the World Trade Center had been attacked, and I was like, I'll never forget, my first thing out of my mouth was, what was the World Trade Center? And then I sat down and watched the news, and I learned about all of that, and it was a really sad day. But that was over 20 years ago. It's just crazy to think about that. So let's bow our heads today and say a quick, say a prayer of thanks and to our Lord. And thank you, Father, for this beautiful September 12th. Today, the sun is your son Jesus. You know, he came all those years ago, Lord, and I want to thank you for that you sent him to die for our sins, so that we can be closer to you, that we can be healed, that we can all one day find ourselves standing in front of you and be justified by his sacrifice. You know, it was you're so wonderful and loving, God. You care for each and every one of us. You show it daily. Give us our food and water before we even have the need to ask for it. You give us the air that we breathe, that we wake up. And some of us, Lord, we take advantage. We take advantage of that. And we don't give you thanks. Lord, I'm saying thank you. Thank you for the water. Thank you for the air. Thank you for the food. Thank you for all the blessings you put in our lives, our families, our children. You give us everything that we could possibly ever need, God, and that's you. You're giving that out of you're giving that up for just out of grace, as a gift. And we thank you, Father. Thank you for all those who watch today, and or those who watch later on, whenever they're watching. Thank you, Father. I pray that the words that I speak today will reach them, and maybe there's something inside of them that they need to hear from it. And I want to thank you, Father. Amen. So, if you've been following along, you know that we've been doing the book of Job, and we've been doing it chapter by chapter, verse by verse. This is something we started a while back with the book of Revelations, and it was enjoyed so much that we're continuing that today. Today we're on the book of Job, chapter 30. Last week in chapter 29, we read and reviewed as Job actually reflected on his past. We learned a lot about him, how, he was a great leader of his people, and how they knew that they could come to him for help. And this week we're going to read as Job goes back to his lamenting. That he constantly does this, doesn't he? But he goes back to lamenting, and he's lamenting the situation he's currently in. And he is just so low, isn't he? He's so low that even the children are mocking him. Also, those who are in the lowest rung of society, even they're persecuting Job. Even the outcasts. Last week's recollection and today's lamenting, we see this sharp contrast in Job's story. So let's go ahead and read. We're going to be reading Job chapter 30, verse 1, all the way to verse 31. But now that they are younger than I have... let me start over. But now, they that are younger than I have me in derision, whose fathers I would have disdained to have set with the dogs of my flock. Yet whereto might the strength of their hands profit me, in whom old age was perished? For want and famine they were solitary, fleeing into the wilderness in former time, desolate and waste. Who cut up mallows by the bushes and juniper roots for their meat. They were driven forth from among men. They cried after them as after a thief, to dwell in the cliffs of the valley, in the caves of the earth, and in the rocks. Among the bushes they brayed, under the nettles they were gathered together. They were children of fools, yea, children of base men. They were viler than the earth, and now am I their song? Yea, I am their byword. They abhor me, they flee far from me, and spare not to spit in my face, because he hath loosed my cord, and afflicted me. They have also let loose the bridle before me. Upon my right hand rise the youth. They push away my feet, and they rise up against me, the ways of their destruction. They mar my path. They set forward my calamity. They have no helper. They came upon me as a wide breaking in of waters. In the desolation they rolled themselves upon me. Terrors are turned upon me. They pursue my soul as the wind, and my welfare passeth away as a cloud. And now my soul is poured out upon me. The days of affliction have taken hold upon me. My bones are placed in me in the night season, and my sinews take no rest. By the great force of my disease is my garment changed, and it bindeth me about as the collar of my coat. He hath cast me into the mire, and I am become like dust and ashes. I cry unto thee, and thou dost not hear me. I stand up, and thou regardest me not. Thou art become cruel to me. With thy strong hand thou oppressed thyself against me. Thou liftest me up into the wind. Thou causest me to ride upon it, and dissolvest my substance. For I know that thou wilt bring me to death, and to the house appointed for all living. Howbeit he will not stretch out his hand to the grave, though they cry in his destruction. Did not I weep for him that was in trouble? Was not my soul grieved for the poor? When I looked for good, then evil came unto me. And when I waited for light, there came darkness. My bowels boiled and rested not. The days of affliction prevented me. I went mourning without the sun. I stood up and I cried to the congregation. I am a brother to dragons and a companion to owls. My skin is black upon me, and my bones are burned with heat. My heart also is turned to mourning, and my organ into the voice of them that weep. Now look at verse 1 again. Let's go ahead and read that one. But now they that are younger than I have me in derision, whose fathers I would not disdain to have set with the dogs of my flock. Now look how it starts off right there. But now. That is a great way to start this one, I think. It introduces that there is contrast between the last chapter and this one, between the glory of the last chapter and the suffering of this one. Here in this chapter we read how Job is being insulted and he's being ridiculed by the same people that he had been helping before. Later in this chapter he says they abhor him. Job is suffering physically and psychologically. He tells us later in this chapter that the days of affliction have taken hold, and he feels like God himself is persecuting him when he says, he hath cast me into the mire. He tells us that they are younger than I. It is a universal custom to teach our children to respect our elders. I'm pretty sure many of you know that. Pretty sure many of you have taught your children to respect their elders. But Job says that they have me in derision, meaning that they treated him with contempt and they scoff at him. They turn his glory into shame. He says, I would have disdained, meaning that he might have disdained, meaning this could mean, their condition, which was vile, maybe. Meaning that in Job's opinion, or in the custom of the world that Job lived in anyway, that they would have been unworthy of of being employed. Job, he goes on, if you pay attention, he says, to have set them with the dogs of my flock. To be Job's shepherds, and to be the companion of his dogs and to watch his flocks. If you look through the word, you'll notice that dogs are often mentioned as filthy and accursed, just some verse. I'm just going to name off some verses here, and we'll look at them. Okay, go ahead and turn with me to 2 Samuel, and we'll look at chapter 16, verse 9. Then said Abishai the son of Zeruiah, I'm going to butcher that name, Zeruiah, unto the king, Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over, I pray thee, and take off his head. And then we can go to 2 Kings chapter 8, verse 13. And Hazael said, But what, is thy servant a dog, that he should do this great thing? And Elisha answered, The Lord has showed me that thou shalt be king over Syria. Now also we'll go to Philippians chapter 3, verse 2. Sorry, it takes me a while to get there. Philippians chapter 3 verse 2 says, Beware of dogs, beware of evil workers, beware of the concision. Okay, now we're going to look at Revelations chapter 22 verse 15. For without are dogs, and sorcerers, and whoremongers, and murderers, and idolaters, and whosoever loveth and maketh a lie. So, as I said, this is a sharp contrast, isn't it? You know, last week we saw, like I said, Job described, his better days, the life that he had before this attack that came from Satan. Here we are this week, and we're seeing the depths that he has fallen to. Job had been disgraced in front of his children, well, I should say not his children, but he's been disgraced in front of children and people who are of low character. Now moving forward, we're going to see how Job describes these people. He describes them as mockers, as vagabonds who had, because of how useless and wicked they were, they're not welcome in society, and they're driven out of the land. But these men have made Job the object of their entertainments, essentially. So let's go on to verse 2. Yea, whereto might the strength of their hands profit me, and whom old age was perished. He is saying that even though they are strong and they're healthy men who are able to do their jobs, all they have the strength to do is to sit here with their hands folded on their chest so that they didn't help anyone. They're so lazy that Job couldn't even hire them to do anything, right? So this seems to be the reason that Job disdains them. He then goes on to say, in whom old age has perished. Now, this basically means that they're not going to grow old. Maybe they're consumed by their lusts, maybe they're killed by their sins, so that if they did do work for someone, it would have been useless because, they wouldn't be doing their job for very long. They're lazy. A lot of people think this is talking about them being really old, like Moses maybe, but no. They're saying they're unfit for business. Or they didn't have the endowment of old age, meaning experience or wisdom or prudence of old people to manage their affairs. Could Job be talking about his friends here? They've been of no help, have they? In fact, they themselves appear to need help themselves. They look feeble, not just in age, but in their ability to help. So let's go on to verse 3. For want and famine they were solitary, fleeing into the wilderness. In former time desolate, and waste. We see the mention of want and famine here. Do you notice that? And then solitary. This means that because of the family, they want, and they're reduced to basically the utmost. They were so destitute as a rock. Then it says that they are fleeing into the wilderness. They're feeding on dry rocks and fruit that they find in the wild. It says in former time, desolate and waste. This means on the evening of desolation. Now, all of this put together tells us what? It tells us that these people are starving to death. They do not even have the energy to speak. They would sit there alone and then have to go into the wild to find food. Things like roots and berries that they could even eat. Job had helped these people before, but here he is now, desolate and in need himself. So let's go on to verse 4. Who cut up mallows by the bushes and juniper roots for their meat? He seems to be talking about bitter herbs. That's what I'm thinking, these mallows and juniper bushes. He's talking about bitter herbs here. This is a way of showing just how desperate these people are. And of course, you know what bushes and shrubs are, right? He's saying that this is where these herbs are grown. If you look at the Vulgate, which is the Latin translation, it says as the bark of trees. Now look right there where it says, and juniper roots. Now this is actually might be another plant, because there isn't a name for the juniper root in Hebrew. We can tell that the people are extremely desperate because of the mallow. It's actually a very, very bitter plant, but it does have some nourishment to it. So these people have absolutely no other choice but to eat the plants so that they could even live, right? So let's go on to verse 5. They were driven forth from among men. They cried after them as after a thief. Now notice how it starts off telling us that they were driven from the towns and the cities. They were driven from civilization. People were treating them like they were unfit. Now, this would seem to be that these people had probably maybe committed some crime. We can tell this because of what it says. They cried after them as after a what? A thief. That means that while they were being run out of town, people are yelling after them, there he is, there's the thief. They're doing this to abhor them, to shame them, and also so that people will know people will know them on sight, right? Job is showing us just how helpless these people are. They have to listen to the landowners, right? They have to. If the landowner says something, they have to listen to them, and they're helpless against them. They can be driven out of the land just like a thief would be. So let's look at verse 6. To dwell in the cliffs of the valleys, in caves of the earth, and in the rocks. I think that this is talking about like brooks, because these types of places were made by floods and streams. Because it says in caves of the earth and in the rocks. This is speaking of where they would have gone because they were afraid, right? Or maybe because of some shame that they felt like they didn't fit in. This reminds me of Horridus. They were the cave dwelling people that go way back to way before even Abraham, and they dwelled in that area near the Dead Sea. Their name literally translates to free people. Horites. Sorry, that's how you say it. This also makes me think of David, because if you remember, when David had run away from King Saul, he himself actually hid himself in the cliffs and the caves there. So let's go on to verse 7. Among the bushes they brayed, under the nettles they were gathered together. And he's saying that, now look at the sound that Job says they made. You know, Job is basically saying that it didn't sound like speech to him, and more like the braying of a donkey. Now compare this to what Herodotus had wrote about troglodytes. You know, what Herodotus said about troglodytes was their language, I'm reading right off my notes, their language is unlike that of any people. It sounds like the screeching of bats. Look what Job says here. He says, under the nettles. The nettles are wild vetches. He says that they are gathered together. I'm sure I don't have to explain what that is, but of course that means, you know, that they are huddled together. They're all right there. They're gathered, like, you know. So this verse says that they huddled together for safety, and that their speech was so unintelligent that to Job it sounded like donkeys braying, right? Now let's go on to verse 8, which says, they were children of fools, yea, children of base men. They were viler than the earth. He says that they had not only been physically degenerates, but also mentally. Did you know that there are some races out there, and like you go out in like the Amazon and stuff like that, they can't even speak more than 4 or 5 words. You know, they can't even count higher than 4 or 5. And they also, you know, some of them have less than 200 or 300 words in their vocabulary. They have a low intellect, but are very, very artful, very, very cunning. You know, these are the people that Job is speaking of here. He says the children of base men, literally meaning they have no name. You know, their peoples had never done anything of significance. They were all unknown and insignificant. He then says, they were viler than the earth. They were run out of their lands. I think it is important, you know, not to take this verse literally. It is basically a repeat of verse 5. You know, we can compare it to Herodotus. You know, Herodotus talked about the Scythian slaves and how they rebelled. You know, they took up arms of the Scythians and they scourged them into subjugation. The people in this verse are people that Job knew to be the worst of the worst. They're evil, and so were their fathers. Let's look at verse 7. Verse 7, yeah. I read the wrong verse a minute ago, didn't I? I did. Because he was told, I meant to read the last verse was to dwell in the cliffs and the valleys and caves of the earth and in the rocks. Verse 7, among the bushes they brayed, under the nettles they were gathered together. You know, I'm supposed to read verse 8. Duh, I read it wrong. They were children of fools, yea, children of base men. They were viler than the earth. You know what I did? I messed up. I'm supposed to be reading verse 9. I wrote on my notes verse 7. And now am I their song, yea, I am their byword. Verse 7 is an easy one, but let's break down, verse 9 I should say, is an easy one. So let's break it down in a part. It says, I am their byword, right there. And now am I their song, yea, I am their byword. This is telling us that they jeered at Job, you know. And these people that in the past, Job would not have even hired to tend his sheep. But to them, Job is a byword and they're just jeering at him. So let's go on to verse 10. Now that we're caught up, since I typed up the wrong number there. They abhor me. They flee far from me and spare not to spit in my face. I'm going to read that to you again, because I really want to push that one in. They abhor me. They flee far from me and spare not to spit in my face. The people are doing this out of pure contempt for Job. They're loathing his sores. You know, then he says that they spare not to spit in my face. Now, I don't think he means that literally. because it seems that they are keeping him at a distance, right? Because it says they keep far from me. He just said so. So he must mean this in a figurative sense, meaning they use other contemptuous ways, such as making faces at him, maybe, or maybe even the way they just carry themselves when they're around him. You know, this could be in his face or even behind his back. So this really hurts Job, because even the people that he felt were vile, you know, even they are ridiculing him. They didn't respect Job at all, and had even spit in his face to show their disgust at him. Just think about that. Think about it. The people are vile. These people that Job we're talking about, they're vile. They're treating Job like he was vile. It's horrible the way he must feel. This is just another shadow of Jesus here. Think about it. They spit on Jesus. They reviled Jesus. They hated Jesus. So they put Job. This puts Job in some good company here, doesn't it? So let's go on to verse 11. Because he hath loosed my cord and afflicted me, they have also let loose the bridle before me. Now, my cord actually shouldn't say my cord. It actually should say his cord. That's what the verse. That way, the verse would actually read more like this: God hath loosed the cord of his bow, and they have cast off all restraint before me. Look here where it says, afflicted me. He is saying that when they saw that God had forsaken him, after he had been his faithful friend and defender for so long, and now his enemy that had been they are taking his opportunity to show their malice towards him. He actually goes on to say, they have also let loose the bridle, meaning nothing was restrained now. There was nothing to restrain them. Now they had that very liberty to say and do whatever it was they wanted to. He even says, before me. They're doing it right in front of his face. Because now, when they used to be afraid of that thought, that, God would find out. The fact that he, in this verse, is God, he, now that he is showing that Job still believes that this attack is coming from God. I mean, yes, God had allowed Satan to do this to Job, but he did it as a test. He wanted to show that Job would remain loyal. The enemies of Job now, they see this is a good time to attack him, right? So let's go on to verse 12. Upon my right hand rise the youth. They push away my feet. They raise up against me the ways of their destruction. Upon my right hand. On my right hand. This part here is talking about the placement, right, of these adversaries in court. We can compare this to Psalms. Let's go ahead and do that. Psalms 109 verse 6. Set thou a wicked man over him, and let Satan stand at his right hand. Now we're going to look at Zechariah 3:1. And he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to resist him. You could also look at it this way. They are so bold that they dare to place themselves on his right hand. Then he says, rise the youth. And actually Hebrew, it actually says striplings. Now think about this. These youth, if you will, would have hid themselves away from him before. We saw that, right? He said that back in Job 29:8. Let's read that real quick. The young men show me and hide themselves, and the aged rose up and stood up. But yet here they are, the ones that were hiding from him, are now rising up to show contempt and opposition to him. Then he says something kind of odd. To us today anyway, this is kind of odd. He says, they push away my feet. Now, I actually thought about this part a lot. It could mean one of two things. The first thing it could mean is that they trip him when he walks by, right? They're tripping him on his heels. Or the second thing that it could mean, and this could be metaphorically, that they're trying to overthrow him and they're trying to cast him down. Now, either way, either way it goes today, and they raise up against me the ways of their destruction. This alludes to how soldiers would have cast up banks and causeways so that they can siege the city. They prepare it. They contrive to use several methods, to destroy Job. So these youths, these kids, if you will, are starting gangs so that they can go on and mock and taunt Job. They're trying to trip him when he's walking down the street, and they're putting things in his way so that he has to go this way instead of that way. That way they can get their upper hand on him. Just causing poor Job more and more misery, just things he doesn't need. This shows they had no respect at all for him. He was just a laughing stock to these kids. Let's go to verse 13. They mar my path. They set forward my calamity. They have no helper. Mar my path. Job is saying that they're hindering him in his duties. They're not allowing him to go and worship God. They're not even allowing him to walk down the pathways of holiness. Then he says, they set forward my calamity. This means they're just adding more and more affliction to him. Increasing his trouble with slander. They're lying on him. Not only that, it pleased them to know that they are doing it. We can compare this to Zechariah 1:15. Let's go on back to Zechariah. We'll look at 1:15. And I am very sore displeased with the heathen that are at ease, for I was but a little displeased, and they helped forward the affliction. Then what does Job say, right? Job says that they have no helper. And this is simple. They had no person to join them or assist them or even encourage them. They didn't need it. They were so sure of themselves that they could get him in distress and that he would be so weak that he wouldn't be able to resist them. Hey, if Job wanted to, he could have even said no helper against them, because Job also had no help against them. No one was helping him. No one was delivering him out of their hands. Compare that to Ecclesiastes 4:1. Ecclesiastes 4:1. So I returned and considered all the oppositions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of such as were oppressed, and they had no comforter, and on the side of their oppressors there was power, but they had no comforter. You see, these gangs of young men, they were no more than delinquents. They were attacking Job every time he tried to do something. They didn't have authority to do this. They're just troublemakers. That's all. Just troublemakers. So let's read verse 14. They came upon me as a wide breaking in of waters. In the desolation, they rolled themselves upon me. They came upon Job as fiercely and as violently as a river does when there's a breach made in the levee or whatever. That had been keeping it back. Whatever had been keeping it back. Or, if you want, as an army that was besieging a city that found some breach in the wall. If you were to look at this verse in the original Hebrew, you will notice that word waters, it's actually not there. That's why if you look in the Bible, it's italicized, right? Now look right here where it says, in the desolation they rolled themselves upon me. Just like the waters, or these soldiers that we were speaking of, just like they would come tumbling in after this breach. Job is saying they pour upon him so that they can destroy him. This verse, the way it's written in our King James, is actually speaking of a mighty force, like water, that crashes in like the dam is broken. They're attacking Job physically when no one is looking. They're doing this while no one's looking. They're kids, right? So let's go on to verse 15. Terrors are turned upon me. They pursue my soul as the wind, and my welfare passeth away as a cloud. He mentions at the beginning right here, these terrors that are turning against him. And Job feels that this is all from God. Sad to think of. He feels that all of these terrible things that have come against him, he thinks it's all from God, and that God has joined forces with these kids, these delinquents, if you will. He says that they pursue my soul. In Hebrew, the word there is actually nedabathi, which literally translates to my principal or excellent one. So my soul is the proper wording, as it is our chiefly part, and it is the object of divine terror, as it was with Job's body, that he was experiencing the pain of these ulcers. He then says, as the wind. This is speaking of the speed, the irresistibility of it. He then says, and my welfare. Now this is actually speaking of all of his happiness and the comforts in his life. He says that all of this passeth away as a cloud. Now a cloud will pass away after all the rain has gone out of it, or if the sun dissipates it. It gets too warm from the sun. And also, the winds can blow it away. Job is terrified by all of this. The treatment by these gangs of boys, or all the shame and disgrace that he must be feeling. It seems from what we hear, that no one cares how Job is feeling. It's honestly what it sounds like. Moving forward, Job starts blaming God and claiming that he's the victim of some, for lack of a better term, divine mugging. His health was it was all gone. His home. And Job just feels cast aside. And this is similar to what we read in Psalms 22:14. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted in the midst of my bowels. You see, Job's life, it had ebbed. It ebbed by, and he was suffering. His bones were aching. He was in gnawing pain, and that pain never ceased. And we will see in verse 30, when we get there, that even his skin has changed. Job is reduced to mud, dust, and ashes. verse 16. And now my soul is poured out upon me. The days of affliction have taken hold upon me. The pouring out of the soul has also been seen once. We also can see that again. If we'll turn to Psalms 42 and look at verse 4. When I remember these things, I pour out my soul in me. For I had gone with the multitude. I went with them to the house of God with the voice of joy and praise, and with the multitude that kept holiday. It's a way of saying that his soul was just gone out of it. He's saying that he fainted and swooned away because of his fears. He then says, the days of affliction have taken hold upon me. He's saying all of his prosperity was gone, and he had come to his days of affliction. You know, the affliction that Job had was so great that he had lost the very will to live. It's all he could think about. Let's go on to verse 17. My bones are pierced to me in the night, and my sinews take no rest. Remember way back when I mentioned that the disease went down to Job's bone? Well, right here in verse 17, we see him say that the disease pierced and penetrated his bones all the way down to the marrow. And that the pain that he felt in his muscles and tendons and joints, they felt like his bones were being broken into pieces. Look right there, it says the night season. You know, back during Job's day, people didn't work at night like we do today. The night was reserved for sleep. So Job is saying that when others are sleeping, he's awake and in pain. If any of you have ever had any kind of pain, you know exactly what he's talking about here. When you're in so much pain you can't sleep. And he goes on to say, my sinews take no rest. Now here in our King James, we see that word sinew. The word that they translate to sinew actually translates from a different word that actually means gnawers. That's actually your teeth. The idea being that every part of Job's body was in pain. If you've noticed so far, this is not some skin disease that Job has. No, he's saying that the pain is in his muscles and his joints and his bones, and that this pain is unbearable at nighttime. So let's go on to verse 18. By the great force of my disease is my garment changed. It bindeth me about as the collar of my coat. What did we just read? Let's read it again. By the great force of my disease is my garment changed. It bindeth me about as the collar of my coat. Job's saying that this disease is so strong, so prevalent, that it was everywhere in his body. It was so bad that it had discolored his clothing. He says, my garment is changed. Notice again that of my disease is italicized, which tells us what? That's right, it wasn't there. The translators added that to help the verse make more sense, right? But look at it without these words. I'm going to read it to you again, but I'm going to leave out those words. With great force my garment is changed, which would mean that he can't even move enough to take it off, because it takes so much effort. We see why when we read on in the verse. It bindeth me about. It's basically sticking to him because of all the nastiness from these sores. All that oozing would dry up, right? Remember what it was saying, that it was oozing, so all of that would dry up and it would stick to his clothes. He goes on, as the collar of my coat. meaning how your collar is close, right? Girding in and against your neck. This tells us a little about the fashion of Job's day. You know, the clothes they actually wore were seamless, meaning that they were all in one piece of fabric. And then they would have an opening at the top, which they could put their head through. And then they would actually fasten it close at the neck. So from this, we can gather that Job had to change his clothes very often because of that pus that was oozing out from these sores. Even though he was doing this, the fabric was sticking to his sores. You know, that's what he means. When he mentions the collar being tight, the clothes were actually sticking to the sores very, very tightly. So let's go on to verse 19. He hath cast me into the mire, and I am become like dust and ashes. So I'm sure we all know the he at the beginning of this verse is God. I'm pretty sure I don't need to mention that again, but I did. Then he says, hath cast me into the mire. Now, when he says mire, this is actually the deepest part of the misery and degradation. We know this. Why? Because what we see in Psalms 40 verse 2. He brought me up also out of a horrible pit, out of the miry clay, and set my feet upon a rock, and established my goings. Now, don't leave Psalms just yet. Go ahead and turn over to 69 verse 2 as well. Verse 2. I sink in deep mire, where there is no standing. I am come into deep waters, where the floods overflow me. Now, verse 6, still in chapter 69, look at verse 14. Deliver me out of the mire, and let me not sink. Let me be delivered from them that hate me, and out of the deep waters. You see, Job, he feels like God has cast him there, doesn't he? But I want you to notice how strong he is in his faith. He doesn't forsake God, and he doesn't stop calling on him. We'll see that later in the next few verses. Now look what he says here. And I am become like dust and ashes, meaning he was unclean, he was impure, he was offensive to other people. You know, they treated him with disdain, they treated him with dislike. You see, Job believed that God had discarded him. Job sat there in these ashes and he prayed. So let's go on to verse 20. Verse 20 now. I cry unto thee, and thou dost not hear me. I stand up, and thou regardest me not. Right there. The thing that hurt Job the most was how to him it seemed like God was remaining silent. He says that it doesn't matter if he's saying he's standing up or he's sitting down. You know, God did not hear him. You see, he knew that the only help that he had available to him was God. He was saying he cried out, but it doesn't seem like God was answering him. Let's go on to verse 21. Thou art become cruel to me. With thy strong hand thou opposest thyself against me. Look at that opening again. It literally says, you have changed and become cruel to me. Job remembers that God had been gracious and kind to him for all these years. Remember, back in Job chapter 10, let's go ahead and read that. Let's just go ahead and reread that. Job chapter 10, we're going to look at verses 9 to 12. Remember, I beseech thee, that thou hast made me as the clay, and wilt thou bring me into dust again? Hast thou not poured me out as milk, and curdled me like cheese? Thou hast clothed me with skin and flesh, and hast fenced me with bones and sinews. Thou hast granted me life and favor, and thy visitation hath preserved my spirit. He's saying right there that God had made him and fashioned him together round about, clothed him with skin and flesh, fenced him in with bones and sinews, granted him life and favor, and by his visitation had preserved his spirit. You know, back here in verse 21, though, Job continues on and says, Thou opposest thyself against me. Job is saying that the power that he had hoped and expected that God would use to support him now is being used against him. Now, I'm sure you would agree with me here if I was to say that what is happening to Job was a cruel thing. Now, what I think it is even more cruel was how Job believed that it was God doing all of this to him. He couldn't understand why this is happening. He felt like it was the hand of God that was against him. Now, let's move on to verse 22. Thou liftest me up in the wind, thou causest me to ride upon it, and dissolvest my substance. This seems to be saying that God causes him to be storm-tossed, like he was straw that was being blown around in a whirlwind, tossed one way and then another, not knowing where he's going. Job feels like he's being treated like a wicked man should be treated. He says, and dissolvest my substance. Job is saying his body is almost gone, and now his heart is melted within his chest. You see, the very thing that Job had said would happen to the wicked man was now happening to him. Job knew, though, that he was not a wicked man. He felt that God had tossed him into the air like a leaf, and he had been blown who knows where. I mean, think about it. Think about it. All the things God had given him are now gone. He goes on in verse 23. For I know that thou wilt bring me to death, and to the house appointed for all living. Job is saying that nothing would satisfy God but his death, which means he feels God is bringing on him this slow, dismal way. He says, to the house appointed for all living. This is the grave, because all living man will eventually end there. Job knows that God controls how long we live, where we go afterwards. He's saying that all of us, the good, the bad, and the ugly, we all die. Our body was not made to live forever. Moving forward, it seems that Job says that God must have some sympathy not to destroy what is ruined. Job thought that as he reached out for help in his misery and received only evil. Now this verse is pretty obscure, but let's read it. Verse 24. Howbeit he will not stretch out his hand to the grave, though they cry in his destruction. Some people read this verse and they say that surely he will put forth his hand against a ruinous heap, though it be in his destruction one may utter a cry because of it. Others read it, howbeit God will not put forth his hand and bring man to death in the grave when there is earnest power for it. Or, if you prefer, I know that you will dissolve and destroy me and bring me to the grave, though you will not do it when I pray for you to release me by death from my suffering. You will surely do it, not in my time or by my will, but only in your own appointed time or as you see fit. Job says, though they cry in his destruction. That destruction here is brought on by death. You could take it as, even though men cry out and are frightened when they die, even when the body is sinking into the destruction, Job desires it. Job knows he has nothing to fear, because he knows what? When he said it before, that his Redeemer liveth. Right? Yes, this verse is very obscure. What I believe it says is that even when we cry out, even when we cry over the destruction of the body, God will not stop death from coming. Even though you're dying, you're laying there and you're crying out, God's not going to stop. I think that's what Job is saying. So let's look at verse 25. Did not I weep for him that was in trouble? Was not my soul grieved for the poor? What Job is asking here is, do I now have judgment without mercy because I afforded no mercy or pity to those who were in misery? No! My condolence acquits me from this inhumanity. I mourned over others in misery. Look what Job says. Was not my soul grieved for the poor? That word not was not in the Hebrew. It seems to be put there improperly, because this would make us expect an answer in that second part of the verse. And the way it should be rendered is simple. My soul grieved for the poor. Meaning not only did he weep, but his very soul grieved. Job had wept for the poor, and God heard it. Job was a very, very compassionate man. Verse 26 now. When I looked for good, then evil came unto me. And when I waited for light, there came darkness. Job is telling us that he was looking for good, meaning he was expecting to continue in his wealth and in his prosperity, when suddenly, poof, all of this tribulation came on him, making it harder for him to bear it. He says, and when I waited for light, there was darkness. This sounds like even after all this happened, Job still had hope. He still had hope that his prayers would be answered. A rest or a pause. Let's read Job chapter 9, verse 34. Let him take his rod away from me, and let not his fear terrify me. And then 10:20. But the eyes of the wicked shall fall, and they shall not escape. Wait, wrong one, sorry. Chapter 20, verse 20. And not my days few cease. Did I read the wrong one? Hold on a second. Job chapter 9, verse 34. Job chapter 10, verse 20. Are not my days few? Cease then, and let me alone, that I may take comfort a little. You see, Job thought that he knew God. We know that already. Job thought that he knew God. When he thought of God, he thought of nothing but good things. He never expected anything like this tribulation that he was experiencing. We know from what we've read so far that Job had walked in the light of God, right? This darkness that he was experiencing was unexpected. Remember, he is not aware of the conversation that God had had with Satan at the beginning. So of course it was difficult for him to understand what was going on. Now let's look at verse 27. My bowels boiled and rested not. The days of affliction prevented me. My bowels, Job says. This is all that is inside. This is not like we say it now. This is everything inside, your heart, your lungs, your liver, all of it. He means it in a literal sense, that his body had violent fever, it was burning on the inside, or figuratively. He was under this great distress, right? He was under all these afflictions, outside and inside, similar to what we see in Jeremiah 4:19. Let's look at that. My bowels, I am pained at my very heart. My heart maketh a noise in me. I cannot hold my peace, because thou hast heard, O my soul, the sound of the trumpet, the alarm of war. He says he rests not because the days of affliction prevent me. meaning it happened before he could even think about it. You know, he hadn't expected any of this to happen. It happened when he was in his later years, right? When the time of his death was near. They came all at once, didn't they? There was no way for him to prepare for it. It seems from what we read here that Job had lived a divine health, and then suddenly he was sick with these diseases. He got no sleep, and this disease made him feel like there was a fire burning up inside of him. Let's look at verse 28. I went mourning without the sun. I stood up and I cried in the congregation. He's mourning without the sun. Some take this to mean blackened, but not by the sun, meaning by the disease. He says that I stood up and I cried in the congregation. Sneaking, you know, he snuck in there and he cried out, not just in secret, but also where everyone could see and hear him. We saw early on how Job put on his mourning clothes. You know, we saw that he fasted, and he even he's saying the ashes and threw them over his head. And he now says that he cried aloud to the congregation, and God hadn't answered. So let's look at verse 29. This actually expands on verse 28. I am a brother to dragons and a companion to owls. He's saying that he is a brother to dragons, or better, jackals, and a companion to owls, or ostriches. We see the mournful cries of jackals referenced back in Micah 1:8. Let's look at that. Therefore I will wail and howl, I will go straight and naked, I will make a wailing like the dragons, and mourning as the owls. The reason I mentioned ostriches is because they also make a weird melancholy sound, especially at night. That's why the female ostrich is called a wailer in Hebrew. Did you know that? Dragons are often associated with evil and demons. Owls are often settle in very desolate places. Job says his cry is loud and shrill. So maybe this is Job speaking of his crying here. Let's go on to verse 30. My skin is black upon me. My bones are burned with heat. Job mentions his skin and his bones as a way of describing the effects of this disease. Now notice how he says his skin is black, telling us that his skin was dark and peeling. You know, I can think back when I was a teenager, I used to work on different farms in my hometown, and I did this so much. I spent so much time outside that my neck was nearly black. If you're watching this and you remember that from when I was a kid, please down below comment you remember that. My neck got almost black. It was horrible. I thought that my neck was never going to become white like this again. And then it started peeling, right? So I knew that this is possibly what Job is speaking of here. You know, Job felt abandoned by God. He felt hopeless. And I'm sure that his physical condition just made it worse. We can see similar things said in Psalms 102:3. Let's go ahead and look at that. For my days are consumed like smoke. My bones are burned as a hearth. Also, let's look at Lamentations 4:8. Their visage is blacker than a coal. They are not known in the streets. Their skin cleaveth to their bones. It is withered. It is become like a stick. You see, at the beginning of all of this, Job had sat. If you remember, we talked about this. He sat for 7 days in a bed of ashes. The burning in the bones here is his way of talking about the pain that he felt. Again, I say that Job is running a fever. This is the second time he has mentioned something that sounds like a fever. So let's go on to verse 31, the final verse in this chapter. My harp also is turned to mourning, my organ into the voice of them that weep. Job is telling us that because of all this, he had laid his harp aside. This could be a figurative meaning, or it could be a literal one. Either way, he says that the music of his harp is laid aside and replaced by his mourning and his organ. Remember, I told you that back then, this would have actually been a pan flute, into the voice of them that weep. So the pan flute is no longer played in his presence. He has only the voices of those that weep and lament. This is an appropriate end to this long lament where he has beat his breast. And he's just been, before all this happened, Job had rejoiced greatly in the Lord. It sounds like here he played his harp and he sang his songs of praise. Now he didn't even play the harp anymore. He laid it aside. And all he did now is mourn. And when he mourned, I should say, it's a sad thought, but here's this man who sang praises to God. But now all he can do is moan and cry. So I mean, it's when you really think about it, we all have our reasons for, I should say, we can all think of excuses, right? As to why we don't want to follow God, or why we turn away from God, or turn back to those evil ways that we used to do, or we like to say that we used to do, but we're still doing them. We're doing them again. If you're going back to it, did you honestly ever turn away from it? But God's right there. I said it a while back. No matter how far you go, no matter how far you travel, all you got to do is turn around. God's right there. He's right there waiting. All you got to do is turn back. Turn around and be with him again. Just like in the prodigal son. When he goes back home and he's worried about meeting his father, but his father sees him from afar, rushes out to meet him. Come home, son. Come home. Come home. Let me cook for you. Let me put a ring on your finger, a cloak around your shoulders. Come home, son. Just think about that God's right there. Again, I want to thank you for joining me here. I am Reverend Jamie McCaskill. This is Sermons in the Park. If this is your first time visiting the channel, please give it a like and a subscribe so I know that you were here. Comment below. When we're done with Job, is there another book in the Bible you would like for me to break down? Do chapter by chapter, verse by verse study on. I'll be glad to do it. I want to thank you for joining me here. May God continue to bless you and keep you, and I'll see you all here next week for an all-new Sermons in the Park. Thank you.